Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and welcome back to my patch retrospective series. Yes, I am still continuing it. We just had a couple of busy months, man. I went to London, Final Fantasy 16 came out, we had a patch, I had a raid series, we had things happening. What can you say? These things get lost, but we're back to keep celebrating A Realm Reborn's 10th anniversary, something Square Enix is gearing up to do quite a bit as well, especially with our FanFest coming up next month. And fitting that a FanFest should be coming up, because as part of this series, we've already finished through all the A Realm Reborn patches, so an expansion is the next thing we get to talk about, in that of Heavensward. Now, while with our normal patch retrospectives, I like to bring out a lot of the features, focus on just what the patch brought. When it comes to expansions, I feel like there's a wider scope for that, especially Heavensward, which was the first expansion that the game was getting after its rebirth. So allow me to start this more with a history lesson, an experience that I get to share with you all because, well, I've been here through it all from 1.0 to 2.0 and now as we go into this retrospective into 3.0. And let me tell you, while yes, I believe there's more energy and more excitement nowadays when there is a new expansion, especially with Shadowbringers bringing in so many people and Endwalker being the finale to the base story that we were expecting and that we were promised, Heavensward was again the first expansion that the game was getting. A game that had been revived and now had hundreds of thousands of players, was gearing up towards its next big release. And the energy of the community back then was something a little bit different than what you experience now. Because it still wasn't really like a global phenomenon. It was still something that people kind of didn't know if they should get into. But within the community, there was this tight-knitness that was just a little more representative of the time. I mean, not to mention what Heavensward was, that initial unveiling trailer at the first ever North American Fan Fest in Las Vegas was something truly special. It was such a rough North American Fan Fest because there were 8-hour registration lines. There was a party that they held next to a pool where we weren't allowed to go in the pool, but we were allowed to look at it. And it was a lot of people in the community's first time meeting face to face and communicating. And there was no expectations. And there was just so many different kinds of people, but there also just still wasn't enough at the same time. But then when that trailer hit and when all that information hit, the way everyone lit up and kind of forgot about the long merch lines and what events they could or couldn't get to. It's just all those things, they just kind of disappeared because we had Ishgard, an area that was teased throughout all of 1.0 and 2.0, the centerpiece of this new expansion, finally being unveiled to the community. We had 3 entire jobs that were going to be released, and while we didn't learn that in the first fan festival, we got to learn it over the course of the next several of them. I mean, these promises of these new massive areas compared to the kind of smaller, compact ones we had with A Realm Reborn. Alexander being the raid, one of the most hype Final Fantasy summons that there is. A follow-up to the gut-wrenching MSQ that was patch 2.55, which we hadn't even seen yet. Keep in mind, North American Fan Festival happened by about the time 2.4. I think the 2.4 trailer released the same weekend as FanFest, or maybe the weekend before, something in that vicinity. I don't even think it aired on a live letter. I think I showed up to FanFest and it was like out that day. And then not to mention, again, the singular prospect that this failed game was not only given its second chance, but it was about to breathe even more life into the world we had come to love. That being said, by the time patch 3.0 rolled around, how did everything turn out? Because hopes and dreams are one thing, but reality is another. And Heavensward's release was certainly a divisive one, but not for the reasons you really hear anyone talk about nowadays. So let's go over some of the major things that happened, as well as some updates to some stuff from A Realm Reborn. So first of all, I already mentioned the city of Ishgard, which everybody instantly fell in love with, getting to see this new piece of history that to this day is still a centerpiece for new storylines and content expansions that we've seen over the course of the different eras of Final Fantasy XIV, has been a non-stop joy. It is an aesthetic, if I could say the word, that everyone still loves, and we also just wish we could fix the place up. Not just the firmament. We want to, I mean, not even the firmament. No, that's what it's called, right? The place that I didn't do any rebuilding of Ishgard. In case that wasn't apparent, I didn't do that. But the point is, we want to rebuild the rest of the city and we can't, and that's still kind of like a sad thing. But back then, that was a really exciting thing to get this brand new city, especially for us 1.0 players. Some other new features, level cap being raised to 60, not much to really say about that, but what came with it, we'll talk about a little bit later. We also got a new race in that of the Al Ra, which came as a big surprise to a lot of people. When we thought the idea of getting a new race was going to come around, of course, people were making all sorts of bets. Now, keep in mind at this point, we hadn't seen this race of characters, but we knew ahead of time that a specific character from the MSQ Yugiri, who was still masked up to that point, was going to be this new race. We could see a tail, and we couldn't see any of her facial features, so everyone started to try and guess that maybe she would be some sort of rat person or dragon person. You know, people just started analyzing what kind of tail it really was and what they might look like underneath, expecting something kind of bestial, if that makes sense. And what we got was this petite, cute, dragon-looking girl who, according to the development team, was more designed to represent like a demon. The horns are supposed to be more demon-esque and less dragon-esque, but all the same, people have since grown to love the race. It is definitely one of the more popular ones across the populace, and so I'd say that overall, while a surprise and not a classic Final Fantasy race, still a success. We, of course, got some new jobs and 3 very controversial at the time, but since still mildly controversial jobs, I suppose. You have Dark Knight, Astrologian, and Machinist. Now, first of all, yes, that is how they said Astrologian on stage. It's why I don't call it Astrologian, even though that is definitely what I called it in some of my earliest videos. Second, all of these jobs have had such tumultuous histories since Heavensward, and on release it was kind of the same. Dark Knight was considered okay, but a bit underpowered by the community. That is until it was part of the World First group for the raid tier that we'll talk about in a little bit. Then you had Astrologian, which was very much disliked on release. It would take a couple of patches before people felt really good about how the class felt to play, and not to mention playing between the two sects, because that was the big thing that Astro could still do at that point. They could choose to be a pure healer or a shield healer, something that would stay with them for quite some time, but, you know, not so much the case anymore, although now I'd argue they're even stronger with the way neutral sect works. And then Machinist, which comes with a whole other topic. Now, we all know about Machinist kind of, again, tumultuous history. It's gone through reworks, it's gone through redesigns, it's had ping issues, it's had consistency issues. It's just a job that's been all over the place. Supposed to be like the damage dealer of the ranged physical, but never really achieving those like high numbers that make people feel like it, and always being kind of shunned and pushed aside. And on release, no different, but not for the reason that you think. You see, Machinist isn't the only new job that people might argue we got in the Fizz ranged category. Bard was also reworked to be a caster. Machinist and Bard both were effectively Fizz ranged casters. They had to activate a skill that made it so they don't auto attack. In the case of Machinist, it would have been Gauss Barrel, and for Bard, it would have been Wanderer's Minuet. And that would give them cast times, negate all of their auto attacks, and increase their damage a considerable amount. However, on release of Heavensward, that amount was severely lacking, given that you lost your auto attacks, had to deal with cast times, and of course now had to do this whole caster balancing thing that you didn't have to do for the entire expansion prior. It wasn't very popular, even if by the end of the expansion, they would be among the 2 strongest jobs in the game. But here, it was arguable to completely ignore the entire role, which, you know, not the greatest thing. And it's not the last time that Fizz Range would go through that problem. But all 3 of these jobs, cursed, if not by the game's actual numerical ratings, but by the community who didn't understand them in the short time that we had them, especially true in the case of Dark Knight. That being said, the other things that were divisive were just also job changes for the jobs that we got. All these jobs had like 4 or 5 new buttons added on top of them. The button bloat became insane. The rotations became incredibly bloated and difficult for a lot of players to keep up with. And overall, it was actually considered a fairly rough time for job design, even amongst the jobs that kind of liked what they got. If you followed my job retrospective series, you'll often notice that I bring up tons of issues that occurred in the Heavensward era. People struggling with Black Mage because of the way Enochian worked. People struggling with Fizz range because of the cast times. People struggling with the tanks because it was expected that you wouldn't use tank stance, and things hit hard in the early parts of the expansion. And the pressure for people who were newer to the role to get in on that was, a bit tough. Healers now expected to DPS, melding accuracy, still a thing at this point, and also needing to output insane amounts of healing, especially in the early parts, was not something people were comfortable or familiar with. So there was all these playstyle, personalities or just play styles just mixing and matching on top of the changes, which made things more difficult for a lot of people who just didn't want to be pressing 30 to 40 buttons on every job. And those are far from the only jobs that had that issue as well. So one big thing that Heavensward took a really long time to get right was job balance. And I would say it never really got the job balance right. There were jobs that were shunned throughout the entire expansion, and people just didn't want to bring them. Sorry, Paladin. Just because of the way they decided to spread out certain utilities, and Heavensward would be the reason why we lost a lot of very particular utilities on very many jobs, because it was just forcing metas that people really just wished didn't exist. Now, getting off of kind of the more doom and gloom aspect of Heavensward, although trust me, we're not done with that category yet, we also have the massive new zones. Now, A Realm Reborn was basically a zone from 1.0 broken up into 4 or 5 pieces. That's how Thanalin worked, that's how Lenosha worked, that's how all of them worked. However, going into Heavensward, they now had the ability to design these zones in such a way that they could be very large. They could have a lot of scale to them, and of course, they had verticality to them because one of the features in Heavensward was the introduction of flying. Now, when flying first came out, the process was still largely the same. You need to collect ether currents, some of them from quests, most of them found throughout the zone, but they were kind of spread out all over the place. They weren't really on the main path. And unless you were doing every single side quest, there was a good chance you would just never even, walk by where one might be. So you had to spam the compass, go out of your way, find them. And then a lot of the times they were just like an extra 5-10 minute run away. And a lot of people didn't like that. They would go back and fix it eventually. But on release, it was a bit of a pain. There were people who got through without unlocking flying just because they just couldn't be asked to go around and find these things. Not to mention, again, also looking for the ether currents in the quest themselves. So, with the ups came the downs, I mean, quite literally when it comes to flying, but either way, the zones were infinitely more loved and open and traversable. And it was fun having the flying and going over things and getting around faster, and really nobody complained about that. But one interesting thing about the massive new zones that I think you'll find is a great history lesson and something you can still actually do to this day. While we were exploring through the world, it came to everyone's attention via a post on Reddit, I don't remember who initially, that a giant black ship was randomly found in the distance in both the Sea of Clouds and the Churning Mist. Yeah, it was just a super random thing, happened at seemingly not random times, but like it wasn't something you could guaranteed see every single time you went to any of these areas, even if you went at the exact same time. And it was this huge mystery that the community would discuss for, months and months and months on end until it was confirmed that that was actually the Void Arc, which would become the precipice of our 24-man raid series in Heavensward. Something we wouldn't see till 3.1, so it'll be in a different, patch retrospect video. But really cool that they would hide stuff like that in the world, and we don't see that too often nowadays. They do hide neat little details or maybe change zones based on events that are happening in the story, but this was just something that was a cool little secret. They never mentioned it. They just let the community find it, talk about it, discuss it, and I kind of wish we had more of that stuff because it's a really, really great community thing that is just, it's just really fun. Speaking of new MSQ, I don't have to say much about the Heavensward MSQ, but just know this. To this day, Heavensward is considered to be one of, if not the best, of the storylines that Final Fantasy XIV presents. And yes, that is even when stacked up against Shadowbringers and even Endwalker, which is the culmination of all the expansions together. That's how much people love Heavensward, the characters they meet there, the journey they take there, and That was true on release. I don't think anyone had any criticisms of that particular aspect of it. It was really the other things where you heard it. And I think when most people think back and say, oh my God, Heavensward was my favorite expansion, more often than not, they are referring to the MSQ and not to the other little nitpicks you'll hear me talk about in this video. And of course, with main quests come side quests, and there were a ton. There were ones that expanded on all the jobs, and of course, that was how you unlocked all your new job skills, the crafters, the gatherers, not to mention just a bunch of other random ones. And a big thing to mention with the side quests is that they actually put a lot more effort into creating storylines that existed inside of these zones that were just more engaging than a Realm Reborn's quest design of, oh, hey, go find this box in this river. Oh, thanks. And then they're gone. Here, it was like they made sure every zone had some sort of continuous storyline that was happening. And it wasn't just told with the side quests. They also started telling that with the fates. Now, they did it a little bit in a Realm Reborn, but they were infinitely more successful doing it when it came to Heavensward. And that was just one of those lessons learned that I think worked really well for them. Of course, we got content, we got new dungeons, we got new trials, but we can't talk about the new raids yet because much like with our current expansions, the raids did not come out until patch 3.01 and 3.05. However, the MSQ teased us on this aspect and gave us a quick little 1.5, 2-minute cutscene letting us know that Alexander was on his way. And we really appreciate that. As for the dungeons and trials, some in there that maybe haven't aged as well. They've also all been kind of reworked since then because of the recent work they've been doing in Endwalker. But among the popular ones, the Vault to this day, both memeable and enjoyable. And I think a lot of people still look back on things like Samal and really enjoy it. Now, the level 60 dungeons were absolutely despised back then. One in particular, Never Reap. I actually got it in a roulette the other day. And all the memories of the suffering that people went through in that dungeon came back. The tornadoes knocking them up, people struggling with the bosses. Quite frankly, I never minded any of that stuff. It gave the dungeon some personality. It gave it a history that a lot of other dungeons just don't get within the community. Most of the time a dungeon goes, you go, oh, that was a cool dungeon, or I didn't really like that one. But this one was iconic for Heavensward. Ask anyone who was around back then, and they will talk to you about Never Reap. So I think that makes it worth it in the long run. Now, much like with other expansion releases, in terms of super consumable and widespread content, it was light. It was staggering things out for the normal mode raids and the Savage mode raids, as well as a new PvP mode that was set to come out in patch 3.05 as well. So the rest of the stuff was really a lot of quality of life stuff. I don't want to get into too in depth because it's a whole expansion release's worth of that kind of stuff. But a few things that are definitely worth mentioning. For one, new treasure hunts. The big thing is that we would eventually get portals in this expansion, but it wasn't on this release. In fact, I kind of want to recheck that because I kind of skimmed past the treasure hunt section, but they had to update it because treasure hunts were introduced relatively early in Final Fantasy XIV's life cycle. They were in patch 2.1. And for that reason, how do I say, they became kind of less appreciated over time. No matter how much they've updated it, no matter how much they've kind of continued to breathe life into it, I don't know about you, but it's never really seemed like people ever appreciate it. But yeah, they added 3 types of time-worn maps. They added, what is it here? Did they even say which ones they added? They see, yeah, here's a bunch of changes to the Realm Reborn ones, but they added several of them. It's too bad that this one wasn't when we actually got Aquapolis, but we will be talking about that in a future patch stuff. They also, of course, had new regular hunts. They had elite marks, of course, that you could do. Company workshops for the free company houses. They added crafting specialists, which did not go over well. Soul of the Crafter wasn't too super popular. And then for gathering, they added ephemeral notes. Now, there's lots of other little things that are in there, but they also updated some old features as well. They added temple leaves, which they abandoned promptly. It was basically like a super leave that costs, what was it, 10? No, I think it was 5. I think it cost 5 leave quest allowances, but only gave you the rewards of 2 or 2.5 leaves. So it sounded like a great idea at first, it's a super leave that costs 5 allowances. It's not really that much harder, but it essentially allows you to spend your allowance faster. That's great if you're someone who just wants to make sure you're spending allowances and still making gil or still leveling or whatever, but the rewards were pathetic. And they were abandoned. We never saw temple leaves after Heavensward. It was like a one and done kind of introduction that had a minor use later in the expansion, but wasn't liked at all. Limit break animations for every job. Yeah, that was Heavensward. Yeah, I kind of forgot about that up until now. Yeah, there used to be a point where the only limit break animations we had were paladins, monks, and white mages. Oh, and black mages. So it was Meteor, Final Heaven, Mighty Guard. Wait, what's the Last Bastion? I think the paladin one is called, and whatever the white mage one is called. I don't know, healer. But then in this expansion, they started adding them for every single expansion. Of course, the big one they would use in all the promotional trailers would, of course, be Dragon Song Dive for Dragoon, because it's Heavensward. There's just Dragoons everywhere. They also made a bunch of changes to stats, some of which have had lasting repercussions on the game. They did like skill and spell speed affecting dot damage. They made like determination, not as strong on auto attacks. Yeah, a couple small things, but the big thing, critical hit rate affecting critical hit damage. That is a mistake that I wish they had never made, because it has continued to make crit a dominant stat from every expansion onward. And in fact, as more expansions have gone on, crit has become more dominant earlier and earlier in the expansion. At least in Heavensward, it wasn't super big of a deal until you could get to like 3.4-ish, like the last patch. It was a little better in 3.2, and then it was phenomenal in 3.4. But then, after that, every expansion that's gone by, it just accelerates its power faster and faster, and it's too much. I wish they had never done that. They also introduced the buffed armory bonus. That's where it's 100% under level 50. Now it's more like for 10 levels before the current max level. So current max level is 90, so level 80. Anything below that has a 100% armory bonus, and then the last 10 levels you need to gain, the most recent 10 levels, only have a 50% bonus. Of course, this was the first chance we had to have that introduced. On top of things like MSQ from the previous expansion, now giving those tiny bits of EXP, you might get like a level and a half, maybe 2 levels, while you're doing 2.1 to 2.55. No big deal, but it helps going into the next expansion. They also introduced some like basic features like undersized party and min item level features in the duty finder, things like the replica Zodiac weapons, which we didn't have in the end of A Realm Reborn proper. So all sorts of these just little things that add up. But in terms of an expansion launch, it was still, you beat the story, maybe level another job, and then you just farm the extreme trials and dungeons for tomes. And there really wasn't much else to do unless you were a crafter or gatherer, in which case you were probably working towards your crafting specialist. So yeah, it wasn't anything too fancy, but we knew the raids were coming. And so that was what was up next. So in patch 3.01, we got Gordius, the first tier of Alexander. And this was also the first time we had a proper differentiation between a normal difficulty meant for everyone, not to be super difficult, and then a savage difficulty. Now, that sounds great on paper, but do you know what we were promised normal mode would be like? And it was an absolute lie, and or maybe just a misrepresentation. We were told that Gordius would be like doing Coil with Echo. That does not accurately represent normal mode in the slightest. It's just like an ultra easy version. It's a story mode version. It's like a normal dungeon or trial or whatever, but made to be a raid. And there's nothing wrong with that. It just wasn't told to us that way. So when it came out, a bunch of statics got together expecting to need to, work on it a little bit. And then we all mowed through it because what was there to learn and do? It's super easy. Like imagine your static coming together to prog a normal mode nowadays. Just imagine it. And I don't mean get together and do it on patch and maybe a bunch of people die because they've never seen it before, reasonable. But I mean the actual expectation that like it might take a day or 2 or 3 to beat the whole thing. No. But that's what people went in expecting a little bit. Even if they said Coil with Echo, they still thought, well, Coil with Echo is still Coil. So maybe, but no. They also introduced a Super Fate and Azus Law. There were supposed to be 2 Super Fates on launch, but one of them just wasn't appearing. I think that was deliberately held back, and that'll make more sense to you when I talk about 3.05. But they also made sure to add some massive buffs to both Bard and Machinist. Now, this made them somewhat more playable, but again, it would still take patches and patches and patches before it really felt like Bard and Machinist came into their own. And by that point, they were too strong. So kind of went overboard. And then another 2 weeks later, we had Alexander Gordius Savage. I'll talk about that in a second, but there were some other things that were introduced in 3.05. For one, they actually buffed some EXP gains. For example, Fates started to be worth more, specifically the ones that were in the expansion areas. They also added 2 more S-rank hunts. Now, in case you don't know this because you don't frequent hunts, on expansion launch, we actually never get all 6 of the S-rank hunts we're supposed to get. We actually get 4 of them, and they normally leave 2 from I think the first 2 zones out. So in this particular case, it would have been Kurthus Western, and it would have been the Gervanian Forelands, if I'm not mistaken. I'm pretty sure those are the ones that were left out, and they've done that expansion after expansion where they've just left out the ones from the first 2 zones. Then we had Seal Rock Seas, a new PvP mode at the time, one that's still around to this day but has undergone significant changes as PvP has as a whole. They also added in red scripts, which were basically like cap tomestones for crafters and gatherers. So, you still know how scripts work nowadays, not much different. And then they also gave gatherers these thing called favors. You could spend your red scripts on them, and it would basically give you a buff that allowed you to collect certain rarer items for a limited time. And the idea was you're supposed to go around and try to grab as many as you could and then sell them because they were used in high-end recipes. A couple people liked this. A lot of people didn't. There's a reason we don't have favors anymore. It was like an artificial supply and demand situation where people, just if you didn't have a good 30 minutes, then you had a bad 30 minutes and you just didn't make as much money, and you could have some artificial supply issues, but the demand was still the same. So yeah, it was all sorts of problems with that. But the big thing is Gordius Savage. It was our first ever official. It's not our first Savage tier because we did have Second Coil Savage, which was really more like Second Coil Ultimate in terms of the way that it was designed and made. So this was our first proper, hey, we had the normal mode, super easy. Now this is the real raid tier. And at first it was going okay. The first 2 fights, went down in a reasonable amount of time. People liked the first fight. People were okay with like the second fight for maybe a week. After that, it was not considered something that was much fun. But then the third fight came around, Living Liquid, a boss that to this day lives on in infamy amongst the people who were around, who survived. It was tuned to the maximum, especially for the way players had to learn the new jobs in that first month, and people just didn't have the performance level to do it consistently. The mechanics were incredibly tight, the DPS check incredibly tight, and everything about it was static destroying. Now, keep in mind, some groups had actually struggled with the first encounter because of a door boss called Faust, where once you entered, you had to zerg him down in like 2.5 minutes while managing all the damage from the ads. And there were groups that straight up couldn't get past him and just wiped and didn't even get to fight the first boss, and then couldn't even clear the first boss in the raid tier, even though it wasn't a bad boss. That was a real thing. It actually happened. But then, if they did make it past the first and second boss and got to A3, most groups broke here. And I mean broke, like straight up not friends anymore, don't want to play together, don't want to see each other, don't even want to log in. It was a really dark time for anyone who had even a remote interest in raiding who wasn't in a group capable of clearing it. I was part of the first 6 groups that cleared it. We actually were the 6th and last group that cleared it without the help of tombstone weapons that would come on the 3rd set of tombstone resets. And that was a really proud point. We almost got world 3rd, but we had a little mistake that cost us a couple days in that fight. But it was just that. It was a static destroyer, and it irreparably damaged the raid scene for the next year or so. Not to mention that even if you made it past Living Liquid, the 4th fight, the Manipulator, if you didn't break on the 3rd fight, there was a good chance that maybe you got broken on the 4th fight, because it was very, very similar. But unfortunately, not only was it excruciatingly difficult, largely because of the Nisi mechanic, even after a cheese strategy was found for that, but it was also just a boring fight. It's just this robot that sits still and doesn't do anything interesting, doesn't have cool attack animations, doesn't have any movement to it. It was just boring on the senses, and it just wasn't fun, but it was still required all this like particular positioning and really strict DPS checks and all that stuff. Although once people found out the cheese strat, the quote unquote strict DPS checks were hardly strict. If anything, it was more like timed DPS checks. You needed to push the boss at like an exact moment or the whole fight could fall apart. And that was something that happened a lot in the old days, but man, Gordius Savage, again, almost irreparably damaged. the raiding community and the game. I mean, it didn't help that when we talk about stuff that at this point, this was all you had. If you were just a casual player who beat the story, you had nothing. You literally had nothing. What were you going to do? So you just didn't play. I swear, start of Heavensward, once 3.05 came around, between the job imbalances, between the people struggling with all the new skills, between Fizz range being as weak as they were, between the raid tier being as excruciatingly difficult as it was, housing still a problem to this day. Heavensward, I feel, almost single-handedly re-killed Final Fantasy XIV. It is only because the dev team after 3.1, and we'll talk about that in the next video, managed to turn things around, and even that hit some speed bumps that I can't wait to talk about in this video series. So yeah, Alexander Gordius doesn't bring back the fondest of memories for me, even if I liked the really tough challenge and I liked the placement that we had on, you know, the tier, but it's not great. It's not great. But anyway, yeah, that's going to be a wrap for my overview, my patch retrospective on the actual Heavensward release. In the next video, we get to go over 3.1. It'll be a shorter video. We'll have a few less things to cover, but either way, I think it'll be a fun time. So thank you for watching. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and stay tuned. We'll be going through all the patch retrospects throughout the rest of the year. Anyway, I'll see you in the next one, and until then, take care.